Hi everybody, today we're going to be focusing on respiratory anatomy. So to start with, let's look at some of the main functions of the system. Um, One of the main systems is to provide a surface area for gas exchange. This gas exchange takes place in the lungs in a location called alveoli with the goal of getting or picking up carbon dioxide from your blood and adding oxygen to your blood. So basically, as blood comes in to your lungs, it's identified as deoxygenated blood, and by the time it leaves your lungs, it has become oxygenated blood. This concept should sound familiar to you as we have talked about it in terms of cardiovascular system before. Now, respiratory system is also responsible for the process of ventilation or breathing, which again, it's bringing oxygen into your lungs and dispose of carbon dioxide that your body has produced as a waste gas. It also helps you with vocalization. So vocalization in terms of presence of vocal cords or your larynx. And one of the important ones that I don't go into, but you will see it definitely in terms of physiology, is helping with maintaining the homeostatic balance of your pH. Remember that your pH needs to be between 7.35 and 7.45 for your body to properly function. Because CO2 is identified as quote-unquote acidic, you can balance your blood pH by removing extra CO2 through exhalation or holding onto CO2 to make your blood acidic by limiting your exhalation. Now, when we look at the respiratory organs, we start with the nose and nasal cavity. Nasal cavity also, surrounding the nasal cavity, we also have what we identify as nasal sinuses. And we continue going down, that basically forms your pharynx. As we look through the pharynx, you'll note that pharynx is divided to three parts associated with nasal cavity, oral cavity, and your larynx. So pharynx, actually, I'm sorry, I've just noticed that I'm missing the word larynx. So air continues down to the larynx after pharynx, which is your vocal cords location. And then continue, this is your larynx right here. And then continue down the trachea and eventually branching into the bronchi. Continuing bronchi as it goes into your lung tissue. You end that with what we identify as alveoli, which are basically air sacs or air pockets where the gas exchange is localized. The other aspect you want to understand is when you think about respiratory system, think about the fact that you have conducting zone as in the air is being moved through the air passageway, and then respiratory zone, which is basically where you will have your gas exchange or structures associated with gas exchange. Please feel comfortable with or study to make sure you're comfortable with identification of the structures. Now, again, this picture is not as detailed as I would like it, but again, gives you a general idea of the passage of air through the respiratory system. Again, starting with your nose, nasal passages or nasal cavity, going down your pharynx, your larynx, trachea, and eventually branching into what we identify as bronchial tree. Now let's go ahead and take a look at our structures one at a time and also understand what is the function of each of these structures. We're going to start with nose and nostrils basically. So you have your nose, the opening to them would be the nostrils, and the separation between the nostrils would be your septum. Notice that the nose is made up of quite a few small cartilage. You don't need to know the name of these cartilages. However, it is important for you guys to understand that the soft tissue, the anterior aspect of the nose is mostly cartilaginous tissue and connective tissue. And then on the superior aspect of that, you will have your nasal bone. Now, what is the job of your nose? Your nose, as well as your nasal cavity, has three functions. It is responsible for moistening the air using what we identify as mucosa lining. It is going to filter the air using the lining of the hair that lines the nasal or nose, as well as the cilia that lines the nasal cavity. We also have the function of warming up the air, which is done by, again, the mucosa, submucosa lining rich in blood vessels. So let's make a notation for ourselves in terms of the three main functions. And again, please do remember that these functions are repeated for the nasal cavity as well. So moistening is done by the mucosa lining. Warming up the air is done by your submucosa, which basically means it's underneath it. And this is rich in blood vessels. And then filtering of the air is either done by your nasal hair or by the tiny hair-like extensions inside the nasal cavity called cilia. Your nose is also acting as the resonating chamber for sounds and houses the olfactory receptors. Olfactory is associated with your sense of a smell. So on the superior aspect of the nose, somewhere right here, is basically within the nasal cavity is where you will have your specialized receptors or neurons that give you your sense of a smell. And the surface of the skin for your nose is covered with quite a few sebaceous glands, which basically produces oil. Again, surrounding your nose and nasal cavity, you have your 4 sets of sinuses. We have discussed sinuses multiple times before, but looking at them again, they're frontal sinuses, ethmoid sinuses, which are depicted right here, sphenoid sinuses, which is part of that butterfly bone inside the cranium. So here's your sphenoid. And then lastly, you have your maxillary bone containing the maxillary sinus. Now, again, moving to your nasal cavity, it is a wide opening right behind your nose. The goal, as I mentioned earlier, it's very similar to what we have discussed for your nose, basically moistening the air, collecting the dust particles, and warming up the air. It has other characteristics and functions, but again, for now, we're just going to keep that simple. What you also notice if you look at the nasal cavity is you have these kind of structures inside, 3 separation. These are identified as the superior nasal concha, middle nasal concha, and inferior nasal concha, which helps with movement and circulation of the air and helping the air basically remove its dust and unwanted debris, as well as warming up the air and moistening the air. Now, by that time, when the air is leaving the nasal cavity, it reaches to the posterior aspect of the nasal cavity, which is right about here, which is identified as nasopharynx, or the first part of your pharynx. Now, the mucus of the nasal cavity, there are 2 types. You have the olfactory mucosa, which is forming the more superior aspect. Again, this is where your specialized neurons will be located in terms of giving you a sense of a smell. And the more inferior aspect of it is aligned with a specific cells called pseudostratified ciliated. Again, cilia is where you collect the debris. And that's basically the rest of the nasal cavity with the goal of, again, cleaning, moistening, and warming up the air. So looking at this system, respiratory mucosa, which is again pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium within the nasal cavity. You have a specialized cells called goblet cells within that helps with production of mucosa. You also have these hair-like extensions right here, that's most superficial lining. which is depicted at 3D picture right here, which basically ensures that the dust and debris and particles are trapped and do not allow them to continue down the respiratory path. Next, again, as I said, we're looking at the pharynx. So pharynx has 3 parts. We have the parts located behind your nasal cavity called nasopharynx, area that's located behind the mouth called the oropharynx, and which is basically this region, and then area associated with your larynx called the laryngopharynx. Couple other structures that I want to note before we move on is notice that there are 2 tubes going down the neck. The more anterior tube, which is where air passes through, is the trachea, which we already have talked about it. And the posterior tube, which is more muscular, is where food passes through and is called the esophagus. The other thing I want you guys to notice is these 2 lines you see right here. These are basically your vocal cords that are creating or giving you the ability to create sounds. It is protected by the cartilaginous tissues, 2 of them visible here. The larger one is the thyroid cartilage, and the smaller one is called the cricoid cartilage, which goes around the vocal cords, or around the larynx, I apologize. We also have this cartilaginous flap right here. This flap is made up of elastic cartilage and called epiglottis. It sits right on top of the vocal cords, and when you are bringing air in or out of your air passageway, the epiglottis is an open position, allowing the exchange of gases in and out of the system. However, if you are swallowing food, in that scenario, this epiglottis flap comes over and covers the vocal cords and the air passageway, which means basically as food comes in, it will not be able to go down the air passageway because it's blocked by the epiglottis. Therefore, the only path it will have is going down the esophagus. Now, again, we already talked about the pharynx, but here is another depiction of where these regions are. Again, nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx, depending on the region associated with either nasal cavity, oral cavity, or your larynx, respectively. Now, nasopharynx, which is the first one of the things that you do want to know is that it contains the opening for the pharyngeotympanic or auditory tube. This is a tube that connects the pharynx to the middle ear, and you will hear that again in more detail when we talk about special senses and your sense of hearing. Oropharynx is the second structure. It is extension extends from the soft palate, basically, which is the roof of the mouth, to forming the epiglottis. And that's the region that it covers. The tissue that covers this is a stratified squamous epithelium, as in, again, multiple layers of flattened cells. And there are tonsils, or 2 types of tonsils, that are associated with your oropharynx. Laryngopharynx, which is the third part of your pharynx, is associated with your larynx. It continues down to form either the esophagus or the larynx, form the esophagus and the larynx. And it's also lined with the stratified squamous epithelium. It is the passageway for both food and air, as we described in this picture earlier. Notice again, laryngopharynx has 2 passageways, going down the esophagus or going through the trachea for the air. Now, what is the main function, or what are the main functions associated with the larynx? Larynx is responsible for voice production, as it contains your vocal cords. It also remains open and provides a passageway for air entry or exit. It is also a route that air and food takes to go into the proper channel, which is, again, what we already discussed earlier. Now, larynx has four main cartilages. The largest of these cartilages is what you see right here in the anterior view. That's your thyroid cartilage. And here is the posterior view right here. So this largest structure is your thyroid cartilage. In male, the thyroid cartilage is more pronounced, and it's known as what we call Adam's apple. The cartilage that sits right underneath that, the cricoid cartilage, is almost a full circle wrapping around the vocal cords. And the last two that we have are a much smaller structure called the arytenoid cartilage and the corniculate cartilage. And you can really see, even though they are labeled here as the arytenoid and the corniculate, it's not really visible here. So I'm just going to shift this and show you the next picture. So this picture you see right here is the superior view of my voice box or my larynx. So here, this U-shaped larger structure, that's again your thyroid cartilage. Right underneath that, what you can see as this circular structure, which is the same thing as what we depict here, that's your cricoid cartilage. So thyroid cartilage and cricoid cartilage. And then internally associated with the vocal cords, we have these structures right here called the arytenoid cartilage. And really a small one right here, there are two of them called the corniculate cartilage. A couple of things we need to understand. These two little strings that you see right at the center, these are your vocal cords. This space that is open between your vocal cords, so from here to here, that is known as the glottis. So when you think about epiglottis, if you're thinking about the flap is going to uncover the glottis, hence the word epiglottis, as in it sits right on top of the glottis. Now, why are we talking about this? It is important for you to understand how you are able to create sound or speech. So when you are bringing air into your lung or out of your lung, you notice that the two vocal cords are apart. So these are your two vocal cords, and the gap between them is open. That gap is the glottis. So that means the air can come in or get out from between your two vocal cords. However, when you are trying to create sounds, the two vocal cords are really close together with almost no gap between them. So here is the open glottis, here is the closed glottis. So in this scenario, imagine air is trying to come from the lungs through the trachea up the larynx. So it wants to pass between these two vocal cords. But because the space is so small, it kind of works its way through that space. And as it passes through, it pushes or it causes vibrations of the vocal cords. And those vibrations is what we identify as sound. Now, if you ever notice, males typically have a deeper voice, especially after puberty. The main reason for that is being that the vocal cords are thicker. However, do note that the vocal cords can change in their thickness, and that basically what gives you the ability to create high-pitched sounds versus low-pitched sounds. Now, moving on, the next structure after your larynx is your trachea, which is the tube you see going down right here, down your neck. Again, this tube is anterior to your esophagus. So esophagus sits right behind that. Now, the trachea is passing through your superior mediastinum, which was the cavity right on top of the heart. As it comes in and enters the lungs, it is branching to two main branches, which are identified as primary bronchi, or if you're talking about only one of them, it's called primary bronchus. Now, tracheal cartilage, which is what you see in blue lines, these are these C-ring hyaline cartilages that are spread within your trachea. Depending on the individual, you can have 16 to 20 of these cartilage tissues. And basically what they give you the ability to do is to keep the air passageway always open. So it prevents the collapse of the air passageway. So if you take a look at the trachea from the superior view, basically this is what you will see. So this is the serine hyaline cartilage, which are basically these blue lines you see right here. And if you notice in the posterior aspect of that, right here, you have the muscle that holds the two ends of it. These muscles called the trachealis muscle. So trachealis muscle basically changes the diameter of the trachea. So if this muscle is contracting, the air passageway, these two ends come closer together and the air passageway becomes smaller. As this muscle relaxes, these two ends go farther apart from each other, making these opening wider. So basically, by adjusting the trachealis muscle through contraction and relaxation, I can adjust the diameter of the trachea and therefore adjust the airflow in and out of my lungs. Now, the next structure we're going to talk about, and this is, I'm just going to mention it to you, and then we'll continue in the next PowerPoint with the air passageway through the respiratory system. So as the primary bronchi enters your lungs, it continues to branch, and these branches are basically responsible for allowing the air to spread to every little corner of the lungs. So we start with the largest branch, which is primary bronchi, going into secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, bronchioles, terminal bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles, and alveolar ducts. And again, alveolar ducts ends with what we identify as alveoli, which is basically where your air is going to end at, and where the exchange of gases between your blood and your air passageway takes place. So we're going to end it right here, and then we'll pick up again the concept in our next recording.